So if you haven't done a webinar before, it's slightly different to a Zoom meeting where it's more of a one-way street. So you'll be listening to me. And there is a question and answer tab. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. The presentation itself is going to take about 40 minutes. So we have got time at the end for questions. You can answer your questions anytime you want. If it's something that I think most people need to know, I'll jump on it there and then. Otherwise, I'll try and hold it back till the end. So if I don't answer your question straight away, please don't worry, I have seen it. It may be it's something that's coming up in a later slide anyway. You've probably heard a fair bit about the rental reform bill. It has been a white paper for probably about the last sort of 6-7 months now. The difference is it's now been actually proposed to Parliament as a bill. So we thought now was the right time to start to speak to you about it and explain what it means to you as a landlord, what difference it's going to make moving forward and how it might impact you. There's also been lots of sort of various rumours flying around about the bill and things that are going to happen. So we want to try and make sure you understand really what the actual law is proposing and what things might make a difference to your tenancies. So first of all, just to sort of confirm, it is only a bill at the moment. So some of the things we're going to talk about this evening could well change. In fact, there's quite a few things that could change. I'll try and point those out as we go along because there's going to be a bit of bun fighting in Parliament for most of this. What I would say, though, is that pretty much all the parties are on board with a lot of the changes. So it will really be just around dates and some of the technicalities that might change. So a lot of the stuff that's been proposed is pretty much guaranteed to happen. It's been in the pipeline for sort of the last 12 months. And a lot of these things have been brought around by pressure from various different groups, you know, shelter, generation, rent, particularly the areas we're going to talk around evictions and the removal of Section 21. And those groups and the RLA in the defence of landlords and trying to help landlords get a fairer deal will probably have quite a big input on some of the changes that do happen between now and the bill becoming law. So the strategy is that it's now been proposed as a bill. That's to be accepted by the House of Commons. Once that happens, there'll be a date where it actually becomes law, and then there'll be a second date, which is what's called an implementation date. Now, based on the tenant fee bill, which came in about 3 to 4 years ago, that took around 12 months in total. So the things we're going to talk about this evening, I would imagine will become physical law within the next 12 months. I should have mentioned at the start, this is being recorded, by the way. So if you feel I'm going a bit too fast, or if you miss anything, please don't worry. Everyone who's registered for the webinar this evening will get sent a copy of the recording so you can listen back and pick up on any questions you have later on. So first of all, the key features of the bill. So probably the thing that's concerning landlords most and has had the most press so far is the removal of Section 21, which I'll come on to shortly. All tenancies are now going to be what's called periodic tenancies. There will no longer be the ability to offer a fixed term during a tenancy. There's changes to the way that rents can be increased, and there's going to be changes around the law with pets in properties. There's also various things that the government have put in the bill as what's called delegated powers. These are things whereby they kind of propose an outline now for what's going to happen, but don't really put too much meat on the bones. But it means that ministers can come back later and enforce them without having to go back through Parliament. So they basically give a general proposal for what it is. And at a later date, they'll put some more information towards that, but they don't have to go through the same rigmarole proposing the bill and take another 12 months. Okay, we'll look at each of those individually, but there are certain things there which will probably take a lot longer than 12 months to happen. Okay, so firstly, removal of Section 21. So as it stands at the moment, you have two ways effectively you can evict a tenant. So Section 21, which is sometimes commonly known as accelerated possession, or more commonly known as what's called a no-fault eviction. So this is whereby, as long as you're in a periodic contract or within the last 2 months of a fixed term, you can serve notice on your tenant and give them 2 months notice, and you don't have to give them any reason, okay? Generally, there's no need for a court hearing either. So as long as your paperwork has been done correctly and the tenant hasn't got the only defence to a Section 21, which is that you haven't maintained the property, generally the judge will just sign off the paperwork and give a possession date without any need for a hearing between yourself and the tenant, okay? Section 8 is the alternative. Now, Section 8 is whereby you serve notice, but you actually give a reason for that notice. So it could be rent arrears, it could be antisocial behaviour. There's a list of about 14 different grounds at the moment. Now, On that, the notice ranges from 14 days to 2 months, depending on what grounds you're serving the notice on. But rent arrears, which is the most common one, so if your tenant is 8 weeks in arrears, you can give them 14 days notice. However, the reason most people don't use a Section 8 notice and use a Section 21, which although it seems longer because it's 2 months, most people don't use Section 8 because you 9 times out of 10 will have to have a court hearing. And also the way it's written at the moment, there's lots of caveats that enable tenants to avoid going to court. So for example, if they're 8 weeks in arrears at the moment, you can serve a Section 8, but then if they pay you enough money to bring them under 8 weeks in arrears, that invalidates a notice and you have to wait for them to go into 8 weeks arrears again and start the whole process again, okay? So most people have used Section 21 in the past as a bit of a catch-all. So effectively any tenant that you wanted out of your property, 9 times out of 10, it was easier to use a Section 21 notice because overall, with the lack of a court hearing, it ends up being a bit of a quicker process. But Section 21 is now going completely. So Section 21, once this becomes law, will no longer be able to be used. So if you want to ask a tenant to leave your property, you will now have to give them a valid reason. And those grounds can vary. Again, there'll be about 14 different ones, but the most common ones will be the tenants in rental arrears, you want to sell the property, you want a family member to move in, or there's some sort of antisocial behaviour. Now, they are actually, although removal of Section 21 isn't ideal for landlords, they are actually improving these grounds. So if we use the rental arrears one as an example, currently your tenant can be 8 weeks in arrears, pay you £100, that brings them under less than 8 weeks in arrears, and it invalidates the notice, okay? That will still be the case moving forward. However, what they're doing is strengthening these Section 8 arrears grounds so that it can catch what we call repeat offenders. So if a tenant goes into 8 weeks in arrears on 3 different occasions over a 3-year period, you'll still be able to serve a notice and you'll still be able to take them to court, even if at the date of court, they are less than 8 weeks in arrears. The difference now is that rather than a 14-day notice period, is going to be extended to 4 weeks. But this is probably one of the points in the bill that's going to be reworded and re-thought through. There's lots of pressure from groups again on the government to say that 3 occasions over 3 years is far too harsh on tenants. They want to bring that down to 12 months. They're basically saying that people's lives are fairly chaotic now. If you've got tenants on universal credit, there's been lots of issues with the universal credit system, as you may well be aware. Payments have been delayed, claims haven't been processed in time. So what they're saying is it could be relatively easy for some tenants to go more than 8 weeks in arrears on 3 occasions over 36 months. The other grounds, so grounds 1 and ground 1A, which are you want to sell the property or move a family member in, although it seems relatively straightforward to say, actually, I'm going to say to the tenant, I want to sell my property and therefore serve notice on them, it won't quite be that straightforward. So there will be legislation introduced to allow councils to issue fines if they believe you've served the notice incorrectly. So if you've served notice on the tenant saying you want to sell the property, the tenant leaves, and then the next day you put the property back up for rent, potentially councils can intervene and say you've served an incorrect notice, and there could be penalties of up to £30,000. Now, what I will say, there's no incentive here for the tenant. So unlike something now, say, for example, DPS registration. So in the current climate, if you don't register a deposit properly and a tenant finds out, they can potentially sue you for 3 times the amount of the deposit, and that money would go directly to the tenant for your error. In this scenario, the money wouldn't go to the tenant, the money would go to the council. There's no real incentive for the tenants to report you other than just pure maliciousness. And if they've been evicted, obviously there is a danger that could happen. Our advice to landlords, obviously at this point, or when these bill becomes law, would obviously be not to abuse those grounds. The wording as it stands though is very loose, and it could be used effectively. For example, the intent to sell ground. The way it's written at the moment is you can remarket the property for let after a 3-month period. So effectively, you would have to leave the property empty for 3 months. You have to demonstrate that you've attempted to sell the property, so whether that's for a Rightmove advert or a board outside, but you could remarket the property to let after 3 months. Obviously, no one's expecting landlords to keep their properties empty forever. So in the current climate, where it's a relatively slow sales market, you could argue that you did try and sell the property. The property didn't sell for the price that you needed, and therefore you had to go back to renting it out. Again, this could be one of the areas where changes are made. There's currently a campaign by Shelter to lengthen the process to 2 years. So looking for landlords to have to keep the property empty for 24 months before they can re-let it. I'm sure they'll find some sort of common ground somewhere. Now, the big problem with the removal of Section 21 is that effectively now every eviction would result in a court hearing. So because most of these grounds are going to be what's called discretionary, it will rely on a judge reviewing the paperwork and probably a hearing between yourself and the tenant. Now, the biggest problem with that is that that could cause some lengthy delays. If any of you have tried to evict a tenant recently under anything other than a Section 21 and you've required a hearing, depending on where you are in the country, you can be looking at anywhere from 6 to 12 months to get a date with a judge. Potentially, you may also need a solicitor. Certainly, any client that we've had that's had to go to court for an eviction, we've recommended employing a solicitor to go to the hearing. Unfortunately, letting agents can't be present. The judge doesn't recognise us. So it's good to have somebody there who understands the law and also knows a bit of the history of the case. But of course, that would involve increased costs for landlords. Potentially, you can claim those back depending on the court proceedings and how they go ahead. But in reality, it's going to cost you more money to evict tenants moving forward. The good news is the government have pledged to reform the core system and they're going to put lots of money in to make sure there's no long delays and no holdups. And if they've pledged to do it, I'm sure they definitely will. Just to point out that 80% of tenancies are ended by the tenant. So this only affects a very small amount of cases, and lots of tenants leave during the notice period, particularly with Section 21s, where they've had 2 months notice. Now, I appreciate that's going to be reduced to potentially 4 weeks under Section 8, but lots of tenants do leave during the notice period. So the court hearings and the long delays will only occur if tenants don't leave during their notice period or at the end of their notice period. And we are talking about a very small amount of cases here that is going to affect. So one of the major changes is that the assured short hold tenancy, which is the standard tenancy that everybody uses by law now, is going, and we're going back to a system of what's called assured tenancies, which is what we had sort of pre-1989. And what that means is there'll no longer be any fixed term allowed in a tenancy, okay? All tenancies will start as a periodic tenancy, which means rolling monthly. Now, this was very strange when it came up in the bill, because going back 2 years ago, there was a lot of talk from the government that they wanted tenants to feel more secure in their properties, that they wanted a minimum 3-year term in a tenancy because they felt to give tenants more security, but they seem to have done a complete about turn on this. The understanding from the things that I'm reading is for 2 different reasons. First of all, the fixed term system is quite confusing. Lots of people who don't work with tenancies every day don't really understand that all tenancies have a fixed term and then go into a periodic contract. And actually, any tenancy you give somebody is effectively a tenancy for life. And it requires one party to break it, whether it's the tenant or the landlord. But we get lots of questions from solicitors and lenders when people are selling properties with tenants in, where the property is, the tenant is outside of their fixed term and then the periodic, and the solicitor or lender feels that the tenancy is ended and it's no longer valid because they're outside of the fixed term, which really isn't the case. So by moving everybody onto periodic, it will make the system a bit more straightforward, make the paperwork a bit easier, and everybody will be aligned. And I think as well, the government took a complete about term and felt that actually it was better for tenants not to be as locked into contracts, and that the tenants could have more flexibility in terms of moving. And they didn't feel like they had to stay in a property if their landlord wasn't particularly giving the service that they hoped. So the proposal is that tenants can give 2 months notice at any period. So they can effectively move in, give 2 months notice, and move out 2 months later. Landlords will be able to do the same, depending on which section they use. So it could only be 4 weeks if it's Section 8. However, the tenant will be protected from some of those reasons for eviction during the first 6 months of the tenancy. So for example, you won't be able to serve the section notice saying you want to sell the property during the first 6 months, okay? You'll only be able to do that after the first 6 month period. Now, there is an exemption to this. This is what's called PBSA, or purpose-built student accommodation. So this is the large blocks of student halls that you see, which could be owned by one landlord or private individual landlords, and they will be allowed to offer a 12-month fixed-term contract. However, what the government haven't done in the bill is roll that out to any student tenants. And if you do have student lets, this is an area to be particularly concerned, because if you have a student tenant that moves in, only stays 2 months or 4 months and hands their notice in, obviously trying to rent a student property at mid student year is really difficult, and you've missed the catchment for that year. So you could end up with empty property for 6 to 8 months potentially. Now, again, I'm sure this is one of those things that will be thrashed out, and there should be some common sense applied once the bill becomes law. But at the moment, the periodic tenancies, the fixed term tenancies are only allowed to apply to purpose-built student accommodation. One of our big concerns with this new rule is that there is a potential issue for tenants to use properties as sort of Airbnb, because they can move in, just give 2 months notice. If someone's on a short-term work contract, for example, they're not really tied into any long period on the property. There's a few things I would say about that. Is that, first of all, with the right due diligence on the tenant and drilling down at the application stage, you should be able to avoid this. You know, if you can find out why the tenant is moving to the area, do they have family in that area, what's their reason for taking that property, you should be able to avoid someone who's looking for a short-term stay. It very much depends on the type of property you've got as well. So certainly sort of a 3-bed semi-detached house in a family area, the chance of someone only staying 2 months is very slim. If you've got a family style tenant where children are going to schools locally, and it's very difficult for them to move, there's very, very low risk of this. If you've got a studio city centre apartment, I'd say you're probably more open to this than anybody else, because there is a potential danger there for someone to just stay for the 2 months. Now, what will happen is there's going to be some what's called retrospective action, so that all tenancies eventually can become aligned. So what will happen is you will have what's called an application date, which is whereby the bill becomes law. So on that application date, any tenancy drafted after that period will have to be on the new basis. So, for example, if it becomes law on the 1st of January 2024, any tenancy drawn up after that date will need to be on a purely periodic tenancy and won't be able to have a fixed term. Then you'll have what's called an implementation period. So you'll have probably a 12-month period where you're allowed to amend your old tenancies and put your tenant onto a new style tenancy. Okay. So when the fixed term comes to an end, you won't be able to renew that tenancy, but you will be able to add them onto a new assured tenancy. Obviously, if we're managing the property for you, that's something that we would do. We discuss with the tenant the implications of that, make sure they understand. We are going to run webinars similar to this for tenants, but it'll be a lot nearer the time once we know exactly what the laws are going to be. At the moment, there's too many grey areas and too many things to be thrashed out before we start speaking to tenants about this. But nearer the time, we will be notifying tenants of exactly what the changes are and how it affects them. So increase in rent. Despite some of the things I've seen in the press, there is no move to freeze rents at all under the bill. That's certainly not been implied. However, moving forward, there will only be one way you are able to increase rent to a tenant, okay? And the reason for this is the government want to basically introduce a more consultative approach between landlord and tenant. So the way it's going to be done is through a Section 13 or a Form 4 notice. Now, again, the good news is if you use Infinite to manage your properties, we've only increased rents this way for the last 3 or 4 years. The reason being, if it went to any sort of tribunal, there was any appeal against a rent increase, this method of rent increase is far more likely to be accepted, okay? But if you've increased rents any other way in the past, these will no longer be acceptable. If you have any tenancy agreements that have pre-stated rent increases, and I have seen them where they have sort of 3% per year, they will no longer be enforceable once the new law comes in place, okay? So the idea is you will serve the Section 13 notice on the tenant, give them a date when the new rent starts, and that date will have to be 2 months in the future. So currently it's only 1 month, but the government are looking to extend that to 2 months. So you'll have to give your tenant 2 months notice that the rent is going to be increasing. And now what will happen is the tenant will have the opportunity to refer that to a tribunal. If they're unhappy with the rental increase, they'll be able to go to an intermediate mediation body who will assess the rental increase and decide whether or not it's fair. Now, that method is actually already in place at the moment, so the tenants already have the opportunity to do that. However, the key to this is to use that consultative approach that the government are advising. So before you serve any section notice, speak to the tenant. Okay, we do it here. Before we serve notice on a tenant, we'll always try and speak to the tenant first, explain why the rent is going up, make sure it's affordable for them. It may be they come back and make a counter offer and we can have a separate conversation with the landlord. But it's always better to speak to them before you serve that notice and agree a figure that you're both happy with. If the tenant does appeal and the tribunal find that that appeal is frivolous, for want of a better word, they can backdate the rent increase. So the problem with these tribunals is, again, it's like a court hearing. They can take a long time, I believe up to 6 to 9 months. So if you serve a rent increase and the rent's going up by £100 and the tenant isn't happy and decides to go to tribunal and they agree that actually the rent increase was fair, but it's taken 6 months, they can backdate that, so the tenant would owe you £600. Okay. If the tenant doesn't appeal and doesn't follow the tribunal process, but decides not to pay the new rent, effectively they will be in arrears. So as long as you've served the notice properly, that notice is enforceable. And if the tenant just isn't happy and decides not to pay the increased rent, that additional rent will go down as arrears, and then you'll be able to evict them on a Section 8 notice at a later date once they've run up the required amount of arrears. So moving on to pets. This is an area that has had a lot of press already, despite it not actually being law, but many tenants do seem to think that this has already come into force. But moving forward, once the bill becomes law, you will not be able to decline a tenant on the basis that they have a pet. So if a tenant wants to make an application and they have a pet, you will not be able to say, no, I don't want to accept a pet. Apart from in very limited circumstances. Okay. What you will be able to do, though, is insist that the tenant takes out an insurance policy that protects you against any pet damage. Now, those policies aren't around at the moment, but there's companies that offer sort of rent protection insurance and things that are already drawing those up. And I'm sure they'll start to become available very, very shortly. And you can insist that your tenant takes out that policy on top of the rent and ask for proof that that policy is in place and proof that it's renewed. The reality is that while the market is like it is and there's far more tenants around than landlords, declining a tenant on the basis they have a pet won't really be an issue. Most of the properties that we rent out at the moment, we go to the landlord with 4 or 5 different options of tenants based on the viewings that we've done and who wants to apply for the property. And we'll give you a brief synopsis of that tenant and their current position, which will include if they have any pets. And if you're adamant you don't want pets, you would naturally select the tenant that doesn't come with a pet. Okay. Where this becomes a little bit trickier, though, is existing tenants. So tenants that are already in a property and request permission to have a pet. Because once the bill becomes law, you will not be able to unreasonably decline that permission. Okay. You'll have 42 days to respond to them. The difficulty here is there's no sort of definition of unreasonably decline. However, if you own an apartment and the lease for the building states that pets aren't allowed, that probably will be one of the reasons in which you can decline a pet. Okay. One of the issues here, I feel personally, is going to be there'll be lots of tenants coming along to view and just saying, no, we don't have a pet, moving in, and then 7 days later coming back and saying, oh, we want to get a dog and we want to get permission for that, knowing that you can't unreasonably decline. However, we'll see when the official wording comes out, but I believe that would be one of those reasons where it's reasonable to decline a pet if it happens in such a short period of time. Okay, so now we're moving on to those things that are coming under what's called the delegated powers or Henry VIII powers, which means they can be introduced later without any scrutiny. So one of the big things that as a landlord you'll need to be aware of is the government are proposing they're going to bring an ombudsman for landlords. So even if you use an agent, effectively as a landlord you have to sign up to a property ombudsman similar to something that we've joined at Infinite. Okay, the reason being for that is the government wants landlords to be accountable for their own conduct and want landlords to be professional about how they run their properties. And the difficulty you've got at the moment is if a tenant makes a complaint to the ombudsman, they have to complain via the agent. And if the landlord isn't willing to engage to remedy the problem, the tenant's left in a position where there's no one to turn to. Okay. So, for example, if a tenant makes a complaint that there's no maintenance being done, but the agent says, well, we report it to the landlord's not willing to do it, the whole thing kind of grinds to a halt on behalf of the tenant. They have got people like Citizens Advice to turn to, but there is no regulator, if you like, for landlords. So the plan is the government will approve a scheme that landlords have to join. At the moment, as agents, we have 2, but the government has said they're only going to authorise 1. And tenants will be able to basically seek redress. So as long as they've got a legitimate complaint around their landlord's behaviour or the standard of the property, lack of maintenance, they'll be able to go to the Ombudsman and seek compensation. And that Ombudsman will have the power to grant up to £25,000, as well as rent refunds potentially. Now, both tenant and landlord will have to demonstrate their case. So you have to provide evidence around how you behaved and the work that's been done and why you haven't done certain works or why the time frame might have been so long. And one of the key benefits to using an agent here is we use lots of audited systems. So if you're not aware, we all use something called FixFlow, which timestamps the date a tenant reports a job. It timestamps when we reported it to the landlord, the contractor. The contractor speaks directly to the tenant, so it will timestamp when it's been actioned upon. If the tenant then doesn't allow access, etc., as a landlord, you're covered. So it's going to be key to make sure that any agent you're using, or if you're managing properties yourself, you use very similar systems, because when you start to deal with Ombudsman for complaints, basically if it's not written down, it didn't happen. Phone calls, etc., don't exist. It needs to be ideally an audited system, worst case, text messages, WhatsApp, etc. Failure to comply could result in a banning order. Exactly how they're going to police this hasn't been stated yet. Personally, I think it could end up a bit like landlord licensing, where only the good landlords end up applying and the bad landlords don't go anywhere near it and nothing happens about it. However, we'll see nearer the time once they bring this out and they start to enforce it. It is a one-way street. Landlords will not be able to complain about tenants. You can only remove a tenant under the Section 8 notices, but they are talking about introducing what's called mediation services. So in the event a tenant makes a complaint, the Ombudsman will advise you on how it can be resolved without having to go down the compensation and redress route. And if an Ombudsman does come in, it'll be very much like the NRLA, where they can offer training, guidance, support to landlords and help you through the process. The next thing the government are looking to introduce, which kind of links into the Ombudsman, is this idea of a property portal. So essentially, it'll be a register of rented properties. The idea being that when you advertise your property on Rightmove, it will have a unique reference number, and then the tenant will be able to use that reference number to link into things like licensing registers, the property ombudsman. They should be able to see things like gas certificates, electric certificates, and it will enable them to obtain a lot more information about the property up front. Now you can kind of see the way this is going, whereby this will link into the Ombudsman, landlord licensing. Eventually, it will probably link into things like HMRC. So the government are trying to sort of bring around this integrated approach between all the parties that landlords need to use, and essentially put all the information in one place. Now, they've been very sketchy about this in the bill. I'll be honest with you, there's been very little information about how they expect this to work, exactly what information they want it to hold, how tenants will access it, and more importantly, how that data is going to be protected. So there's lots of GDPR issues with this which are yet to be confronted, how it's going to be managed even, whether it's going to be done through agents or through the portals. But again, they put it in as what's called delegated powers. So this will be coming moving forward. We're just waiting for a lot more meat to be added to the bones. And now, one thing the bill didn't really touch too much on, which was a big surprise for most people in the industry, was something called the Decent Home Standards. Now, you may have heard of this before. It's already in the social housing sector, and there's recently been lots of press about it with the cases in Rochdale, where the little boy died from the mold and condensation in the social housing apartment. So it's had a lot more press recently than it has over the last few years. But the government have stressed that it will be coming. They're committed to introducing it to the private rented sector, okay? Their own figures are currently that 21% of the current rental market doesn't meet the Decent Home Standard. and will need to be upgraded. However, they are looking at introducing cost caps. So similar to what they're proposing with energy performance certificates, whereby they're expecting you to upgrade the property to meet EPC level C, there will be some financial limits on what they expect you to spend on the property. Those are being challenged at the moment, though, particularly on this, not so much with the EPCs, but the challenge is that, well, if this is all about safety, there shouldn't really be any cost limits on what landlords have to spend to get the property safe. It's more about the safety than the cost element. However, I wouldn't be surprised if some cost caps did remain, depending on the score your property got, which I'll come on to in a second. So decent, there's a definition actually in the standard of what is described as decent. So free from most serious health and safety hazards or carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay. Now, as a landlord who rents a property, and particularly if you rent it through an agent, I would expect you to easily fall into this category already. We ensure that every move-in, every inspection, smoke alarm, CO2 alarms are in place, and we'll pick up anything to do with fire risk, fall risk, etc. So it's certainly nothing to be concerned about in that regard. However, there's lots of other things in the Decent Home Standard which are very grey areas. So kitchens and bathrooms will need to be located correctly. Now, this could relate to something like, I've not seen this very often, but I have seen the odd house where you have to walk through a bedroom to get to a bathroom. Under Decent Home Standards, that wouldn't be allowed. You'd have to create some form of corridor to get to the bathroom so that nobody had to walk through a bedroom to get to them. They need to be adequate and not too old. Again, I'm not quite sure who the judge is on how old a kitchen or bathroom needs to be. As long as they're in working order, I don't see what the issue is with an avocado bath suite, as long as it works. Decent noise insulation, so this could relate to neighbouring properties, probably more applicable to older apartments. And within the Decent Home Standards, the government is still committed to making sure every rented property in the private rented sector is an EPC band C, which has now been moved back to 2030. It was originally 2025, it's now been pushed back to 2030. So the proposal is that as a landlord, you will self-declare if your property meets the Decent Home Standards via the portal. So again, you can see how all of this now is starting to link in with the Ombudsman, the portal, Decent Home Standards, and then with penalties of, again, up to £30,000 for misinformation. So if you declare your property as fit and somebody else decides it isn't, there could be strong penalties and could potentially be a criminal offence. Now, the system that they've muted will work very similar to the way it works in the social housing sector. So essentially, there's four main criteria that you have to try and fulfil, which is the property meets the statutory minimum requirement for housing, and that will be issued a lot nearer the time what that minimum requirement is. It's in a reasonable state of repair. It has reasonably modern facilities and services, and it provides a reasonable degree of thermal comfort. Now, those four things, you'll notice use lots of words like reasonable, reasonably modern, which are very grey areas, and it's very difficult to decide whose standards you're trying to meet here, because people have lots of differing living standards. However, I have seen things in the social housing sector where, for example, the clause reasonably modern facilities, housing associations have been pulled up because bedrooms don't have enough plug sockets in. So we'd expect at least 2 double sockets now in a bedroom to enable people to have a light, charge their phone, a TV, which is what you would kind of expect under modern living standards. But under the system, essentially, there's 29 potential hazards, and each hazard gets given a score. And if your property goes over 1,000, it will be deemed as serious, and you're putting the tenant's health and safety at risk, and you won't meet what's called the minimum standards criteria. And you'll be given an order to therefore put the property into a condition that brings it back to living standards. Okay. There are certain exceptions where they will allow you to wait until the next void period. So they won't expect you to do certain works while the tenant's in the property. You'll be allowed to wait until that tenant leaves and do the work while the property is empty if it's something that they feel is going to disrupt the tenant or create even further risks. And the last point, so the government are again proposing new laws regarding discrimination. So basically what they want to do at the earliest opportunity, so this will probably come in very shortly after the main part of the bill becomes law, is they want to protect tenants with children, people that are on benefits, and prevent any discrimination. Now, if you're an agent or if you're a landlord who's advertising properties as no children, no DSS, etc., then you must be crazy anyway, because those things all come under various discrimination laws. And really shouldn't be on any property advert. What they're trying to cut out here is what they call active discrimination. But again, it comes back to the pets issue, whereby while the market is as buoyant as it is, and there's far more tenants than properties, as a landlord, you really do have the option to cherry pick what tenant moves into your property and the tenant that suits you best. Okay, so there shouldn't really be any reason for any of these discrimination rules to worry good professional landlords. So just some conclusions there before we go on to the questions and answers. So hopefully everything I've told you hasn't spooked you too much and made you feel like buy-to-let is changing. Lots of the things that are in the bill, to be honest, we've been doing it Infinite for a long time. The way that rents are increased, letting people go on to periodic tenancies after their fixed term, we've kind of encouraged landlords not to renew tenancies, mainly because you can serve a Section 21 when you're in a periodic tenancy. It's easier to get tenants out. But yeah, lots of the things that are coming through in the bill are not things really that are going to impact your day-to-day landlording too much. What will happen, I feel personally, is that rents are going to increase even further. Landlords are going to be burdened with more costs, and they will have to be passed on to somebody. The quality of properties on the rental market is going to improve dramatically, not overnight, but certainly over the next sort of 3 to 4 years. I feel like the quality of properties on the market are going to improve. Tenants will have even less properties to choose from. The amount of stock in the market is going to decrease, and therefore rents will continue to go up. From our point of view, there'll be a lot more requirements for guarantors moving forward for tenants, particularly with the ability to evict people becoming slightly more difficult. So we'll be putting guarantors in place for just about every tenant where we can. Obviously, that will be based on the consultation with the landlord. And as a landlord myself, I would strongly be considering adding rent protection insurance to my portfolio moving forward, particularly if rents continue to increase. So if a tenant leaves and your rent goes up by £100 when it's remarketed, I'd strongly advise buying a rental protection policy moving forward and just taking an increase of £70. I know there's lots of other increases around at the moment, like mortgage protection, etc., mortgage interest rates, etc. However, with the changes that are coming up to Section 21's, rental protection insurance will be worth its weight in gold moving forward, because you could potentially be waiting a long time to get any payments from tenants. And rental protection insurance, if you're not aware, will effectively pay out in perpetuity until you get the property back vacant. There will absolutely be more responsibility on landlords, and the government will want landlords to act more professionally and treat buy-to-let as a business. Whether you've got one property or 50, they will expect you to treat it now as a business moving forward, and essentially take more of a hand in what's happening. It won't be enough moving forward just say, well, I've got an agent, I don't need to get involved too much on a day-to-day basis, because when things do occur, you'll be expected to understand why things are happening. So that's the end of my presentation. We'll move into the question and answer section. We've got about 15 minutes. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to add them to the box, and we'll go through them. I'll start reading them out as we go. Okay. Okay, so I've got a question in. Can you still ask for higher deposits for pets? No. The 5-week maximum deposit law will stay in place. That came in place roughly, going back probably about 3 to 4 years ago now, when the tenant fee ban came in. So that will still stay in place. You won't be able to take any deposit higher than 5 weeks rent. You can, however, as I say, get the tenant to take out pet insurance, which they can pay on top of their rent. How will rents increase if that is limited to once a year? So yeah, it's exactly the same as it is now. So you can only serve the Section 13 notice on a tenant once every 12 months. In terms of the amount the rents will increase, that will really depend on the market. So you can't just use a statutory figure. So you can't just say, right, I want my rent to go up by 5% every year. It's not going to work like that, unfortunately. If the market doesn't indicate that's what the market rent is, you won't be able to increase it by that much. Similarly, if the market rent is more, you'll be able to increase it by more, but you'll only be able to increase the rent once in every 12-month period. Can you evict if you want to make huge changes to property? Yes, you can. One of the grounds for eviction will be that the property needs significant works doing to it. However, you will be looking at a longer notice period. You'll be looking at 2 months, I believe, for that ground. Are the reforms being introduced earlier in Wales? The reforms in Wales have kind of already happened. So if you're a landlord in Wales, you'll probably know about something called Rent Smart, which is effectively the ombudsman now for landlords in Wales. So lots of these things have already been implemented there. The rental reform bill as such won't cover Wales. They've now got delegated responsibility where it comes to tenancy law. They have their own tenancy agreements. But effectively, a lot of the reforms we've talked about tonight are already in place in Wales, or a similar version of them are already in place. Can you foresee a slump in house market and leaders becoming law? Could it potentially be an influence of rented properties? Yes, possibly. I do believe there'll be a number of landlords exiting the market, particularly older landlords who may only have 1 or 2 properties, and it's no longer viable for them, especially where they've got mortgage on those properties and the rates have increased. I can see some landlords coming out. A lot of this as well is because the press that this is getting, where it's, it's indicated that everything is on the side of the tenant. You'll see from tonight that yes, tenants are going to have a bit more power. However, some of these changes that are being made, to be fair, needed to be made, but buy-to-let should be a more professional business. So I don't think it's going to drive as many people out as people are saying. Do we have to pay an ombudsman? I would say yes, there'll definitely be some sort of fee for joining the ombudsman. It will be totally different to what agents pay. We pay quite a substantial fee. I'd imagine for a landlord, it's going to be a lot cheaper. Obviously, if you only got 1 property, compared to an agent who might have 1,000 under management, the chance of getting a complaint is very slim, and it'll probably be tiered. So the fee that you pay will probably depend on how many properties you own. Thanks, Darren. How do we ensure the property is kept in good condition, giving extra protection for tenants? The key thing here will be inspections. So manual inspections every 6 months, online inspections in between where we can. As a landlord, I would probably recommend, if the property is local to you, to even consider doing your own inspections, given that you're going to be potentially regulated by an ombudsman when that comes forward. Essentially, there is going to be a ground for a tenant not keeping a property in good repair. The details of it are still to be released. It is in the bill, though, so if a tenant isn't looking after the property, you will be able to evict them. The notice period on that is going to be around 4 to 8 weeks, still to be thrashed out, but it will be one of the reasons where you can ask a tenant to leave your property. Can you please elaborate on the reason for obtaining a rental protection policy relevance for landlords? Well, the reason I would recommend rental protection, I kind of recommend it to everybody now anyway. But moving forward, it is going to be more difficult to get your property back. And if you are relying on a court hearing and the government doesn't do what it suggested in terms of pumping more money into the court system, which at the minute is completely overworked, then the length of time it's going to take to get your property back is going to be a lot longer. The benefit of rental protection policies, they will pay the rent while you're waiting on that court hearing. Effectively, they will pay the rent from the day the tenant goes into arrears. Depending on the policy, it's normally in arrears though. So if the tenant misses a payment, it will take a month to get your first payment from the insurer, but they will continue to pay until you get possession of the property back. And most policies will pay for 2 months after you've got possession back as well, in case of work needed to do to the property. Again, depending on the policy, it will hopefully have a legal fee protection. So if you do need to evict a tenant, and based on the fact now all evictions will need court hearings, and you'll probably need some legal advice, that will all be covered under your policy, so you won't have a big solicitor's bill when it comes to the court hearing. Can you give examples of what are reasonable repairs? What repairs can they go for? Well, this is always a really difficult one, because it all really depends on someone's living standards, if you like. So lots of houses have lots of little niggly things wrong with them that lots of people live with. And we find this a lot when a tenant leaves and we put a new tenant into a property, where there's lots of things the previous tenant just put up with, that they just live there, it's fine. It might be a door squeaked, for example. Well, the new tenant moves in and says, look, I'm not happy with that door squeaking, it's waking up my baby every time I get up in the night for a glass of water, I want it fixing. Is that a reasonable repair? Probably not, realistically. As a landlord, you might be inclined to say, look, just let that go. I'm not sending someone around to fix a door hinge. Reasonable will come down to what you and the tenant feel is reasonable at the end of the day. Generally, what you're looking at is, do things jeopardize a tenant's health and safety and affect their method of living? So things like hot water, running water, heating, those things have to be dealt with relatively quickly. Can agents give more guidance on rent increases? Absolutely, we do that now. So if the landlord's looking to increase rent, obviously we try and advise them on what we feel the market rent is for that property at the point of trying to put the rent up. And again, depending on the tenant, the relationship with the tenant, we'll try and advise what we feel is the most appropriate rent at that point in time. How are the government trying to work with responsible landlords to ensure that the private housing stock will support the public sector stock, given its reducing quantity and quality? Well, at the moment, it feels like they're not, to be honest with you. It feels like landlords are being hammered left, right and centre with tax increases, amendments to the law, mortgage rate increases. It doesn't really feel like landlords are getting much support from the government at all at the moment. However, what I would say is that the reason they're doing this is to try and bring about a more professional landlord, which will increase rents. In terms of improving the number of stock, I'm not really sure how they do that other than start to build lots of property. We've got a massive shortage of property in the UK, as you already know. And without going out and building lots more, sort of correcting the supply and demand balance is kind of impossible. It can't be down to private landlords to do it. There just isn't enough existing properties there. Do I need to join the Ombudsman? Not at the moment. Obviously, we'll notify you well before any of these things come into place. There'll be lots of webinars coming up or videos that we send out to everybody to explain any changes. As soon as any of these things move forward and we get more information, we'll be keeping you updated. If you're unfortunate and tenant leaves within 2 months, how would finder's fees work going forward? If I'm honest, I don't know. We're looking at that at the moment. Obviously, as it stands, if you have a tenant on a 6-month contract and they leave after 6 months, we'd have to charge a finder's fee for a new tenant. We're trying to put all tenants onto 12 months fixed periods moving forward to avoid that for landlords. However, when new periodic tenancies come in, we're going to have to look at how fees are charged and what the process is. The reality is we're going to be recommending a tenant that stays for a longer period. And hopefully, if the market continues as it is, when you come to rent your property, you should have the choice of 4 or 5 good quality tenants that want to rent your property. And part of the decision about who moves into your property will be how long you expect them to stay. What are their reasons for taking that property? So, for example, if you've got children going to a local school, they're generally a good bet that they'll stay in the property a long time. Okay, so that looks like all the questions have been answered. As I've said, if you have registered for this evening, this has been recorded and we'll be sending it out probably early next week via our YouTube channel. I'll get it over to everybody as soon as we can. Thank you very much for joining. You should all have my email address. If you do think of any questions after this, please feel free to email me. I will notify you as soon as there's any updates at all and anything else we think you need to know. Have a great evening, enjoy the sunshine, and look forward to speaking to you all soon.